Welcome everyone to part two of our podcast series celebrating the AHEAD conference in the United States in mid-July. I'm really pleased to be joined by Amanda Kraus, who's the president of AHEAD in the US and also works at the University of Arizona, and also Jennifer Pusateri, who's UDL, well, they're both UDL specialists in all fairness, but Jennifer works at the University of Kentucky. So if you haven't listened to part one of the podcast, I'm going to recommend that you do, because we've had an amazingly energetic and passionate conversation, I think, about actually where we're at in terms of UDL and higher education. And for this part of the conversation, we're going to be focusing on the student experience and the student voice and the importance of having students being part of the design process. How can we foster meaningful student-led conversations that support the development of inclusive design?
I just want to kind of underscore how much power students have at a college or university. So in the post-secondary environment, students have a lot of presence and opportunity to influence change. And I think good staff members can help develop students' advocacy skills, all students, and support them in making change at the institutional level. So I do think it's very important to be engaging with students in and around their courses and how they're experiencing the curriculum. I think that we're like on the precipice of like a reckoning, right, with higher ed, just like we've seen this great resignation, quote unquote, across the US, and people just are like, I don't want to go back to work. I want work to look different. I think students are saying that too, like classes can look way different, and I want to push for that. So, as faculty, and I'm speaking as a faculty member, like we love our classes. We spend so much time building the syllabus and picking the right readings and the guests, and we're putting it all together, and sometimes it's hard to think about how we would ever change it to make it better, but we need to ask, right? And I think we can keep in conversation with students before, during, and after our particular class. So we might work with students one class, one semester, but here's the breakdown, here are the goals, here are the different ways that I've built in opportunities for engagement, or here are the different ways that you can demonstrate, to each other and to me what you've learned. How does that sound? Right? Check in. I check in every week in my class. I do, a more intentional assessment at the end of the semester that's different than what the university requires. But, I think we have to be flexible and responsive, so like, what is the point of just digging our heels in, and I'm speaking from a very, I will say, kind of privileged perspective as a faculty member who teaches one class a semester, a small class of graduate students. It's not my full-time gig, so it's, an add-on. But, I know that things are different when you're teaching hundreds of students or when you're teaching in a lab. I have the opportunity to be in a more of a qualitative, discussion-based, small classroom with graduate students, but I'm taking the opportunity to ask them regularly what they need, how it feels, what feedback they have, and then I'm changing things as we go. And I always have my syllabus open for next year, and I make notes, based on what the students are telling me this year. So I think it is very important to the educational experience to promote universal design, is to be responsive to student feedback. But as the faculty member, you need to ask.
I was also thinking about this idea of accommodations, and I'm not sure where this idea came from, but it seems from my experience working with faculty members and also with the Disability Resource Center that I think faculty somehow think they're not allowed to ask students about anything related to their disability. I think because of that, we see some of this fear that we actually talked about in our last episode about this idea that, well, I can get sued. And that's, kind of driving some of the things that I think faculty are scared about. But like there have been several times when I've worked with faculty and we're trying to figure something out as far as accommodations go. And I said, okay, so now when you talk to the student about their accommodations letter, what did they say? What did they say has worked for them in the past? They're like, well, what do you mean? I said, what? when you had a discussion with when the student handed you their letter, and you said, okay, great. Like, what did you do? That they don't have that conversation, you all. Like, I don't know what's going on. So I think there's some confusion as to like what kinds of things can I ask the students about their disability, about this accommodation, about what's worked well for them in the past, and what things should I not ask about. So I think some of that confusion is driving even more of this fear about making sure that that they don't get sued, and that students are, I just don't think they're getting what they need because we're not asking them.
I'd like to learn from this conversation. So there's a question which is about, in and across the US, is there the opportunity of the independent student voice being captured? So I can parallel that with practice in the UK. So in the UK, all universities will have a students' union, including further education colleges as well. So from about the age of 16 onwards, there will be independent students' unions, and their ability to capture the student voice and then work with the university or college to demonstrate change is one that provides a little bit of distance. So the university will listen to an independent voice representing the student voice. And so this works in essence as part of the feedback loop. So if students on a particular course at a program committee kind of stage are saying, we're really not happy with this, I have observed practice that you've mentioned, Amanda, where the program leads are saying, okay, we can change that. In fact, let's try that and then come back to you and review that together. Now that's really agile thinking. Is it the norm? Definitely not the norm. And even at the formal stages of responding to feedback directly from students, how impactful are the changes that are then made for the next cohort of students starting that same program? No, I'm not sure about that one either. And I'm wondering whether there are similar parallels that exist for you guys in the States.
Maybe, and Jennifer, please jump in. We don't have independent student unions in the States. And there are likely going to be student governments or clubs on every campus that would represent the interests of students, whether that's, student government, I'm using quotes, or whether it's a cultural center group, or, there's lots of different types of clubs and organizations and activities that students will join that are formalized, that represent a particular interest. I think it also is going to depend on the type of institution, and I'm sure that that's true in the UK as well and around the world. But, if you're not at a teaching-oriented institution, that feedback loop and the feedback at all might not be taken with the same credibility or with the same kind of intent to respond. There are many, many large research institutions where research is what faculty are being, kind of promoted by, and teaching is not the priority. So I do think if a student club or a group of students, at a teaching oriented college brought concerns up to the administration, that would go differently than would it be at a research intensive institution. At Arizona, and I think this is not uncommon, students have taken in the last few years to like lists of demands. I don't know if that resonates with anyone else, but it's like, dear president, dear provost, dear senior leaders, here's a list of demands. And our institution like drops everything to respond to this any list of demands. And, I think that's interesting. But it also reminds me how reactive institutions can be, right? It's like, oh, they've asked us for something, we need to do it now, versus how are we committed to this dialogue and this ongoing kind of feedback loop. So I think students have lots of different ways they can share their feedback. And depending on the type of institution, the type of feedback, I think that will determine what actually changes.
Yeah, and so my university is a large research one university, and so our focus is on research. And while we have just a lot of really solid instructors and a lot of faculty that are doing some really innovative teaching, um, it seems like that feedback loop happens after the fact. And so the way that students provide feedback is through an end of course, like student I forget what they're called, like a student evaluation, like they fill a course evaluation. And so they fill out an evaluation after the course is over, basically, like it's in like the last 2 weeks of courses. Um, and then often the instructors don't get that until like a month or two afterwards, right? And so the students have maybe made recommendations or said that this would be a really good change for this course. Well, they'll never see that change because that's going to happen the next semester. So one of the things that our office has been doing is the Center for Learning and Teaching on our campus is offering a mid-semester feedback, and it's nothing magical, right? Like it's very simple. We come in, we ask students a couple questions. The instructor's not there. The students give us honest feedback, and then we share that with the instructor in the middle of the semester. And so when that happens, then the instructors can then make changes and can even, tell students explicitly, hey, I appreciate the feedback you've provided. I'm going to make the following changes because of what you have shared with us. And so, but that's an optional thing at our university, right? Most people wait until the end of the semester. Students they're responding to the feedback or the evaluation rather for the course as they're figuring out what final grade they need to have, right? So they're a little on edge at that point anyway. We also know that there's a lot of, there are tons of problems with student evaluations having to do with race, having to do with gender, et cetera. And so I feel like the feedback that instructors do get from students is often kind of, it's tainted in a way. And I don't think that faculty take it seriously because they feel like, well, this is because I have given them an F on this assignment, or like this is because whatever. There are a lot of reasons for that. So it doesn't seem like there's a really a good setup for student feedback at our universities.
That's really interesting, and I think there's similarity in terms of you're going to get excellent pockets of best practice, like you say, even within one organization or provider. But then there's the sense of, okay, so if I went to University A here, would I get a better experience and be heard by comparison to going to this university over here? So this actually introduces the level of, I suppose, there's a question around what is equity. So from a student voice perspective, shouldn't student voice be an equitable experience right across the sector as a standard? I'm saying that slightly rhetorically. I think we can all probably.
The answer is yes.
Yes, I know. I think it's and similarly here, if I was to raise that question with colleagues, we'd all be saying the same thing. And I think so. The intention is there, but then I think this goes back to something we discussed in the previous podcast, which is we're specialists, and in some ways, because we're immersed in a world that takes into account the differing needs of the student community and what that means as a whole, there's almost an expectation that, well, that should be the case elsewhere. And when we were talking about kind of senior leadership and how that influences change and what needs to change there, but also the student voice is a really important component in that. It would be safe to say, right, regardless of whether you're based in the US or in the UK, we wouldn't be even having this conversation talking about education if there weren't students studying. So I've always kind of been grounded by, actually the only reason I'm in this position is because of the fact that there is a student community and they are the next generation of our workforce, and therefore, and year on year, our knowledge should be developing in terms of ensuring that there is equity from a student perspective. Thinking about, I suppose, the recent, particularly the last few years, and we've talked about the pandemic to a certain degree. One of the things that I know is coming up, particularly in the UK, is this element, and even today I've seen a few forum trails associated with student loneliness. And so that aspect of, we talked about the hybridization of delivery to students, either that's remotely online or on campus or a bit of both. that exists over here in the UK as well. But also one of the things that has been coming up, particularly for second and third year students, so those that were here in the midst of the pandemic at its peak point, have increased levels of loneliness as a result. And that's a topic that's coming up in terms of the impact on mental health and well-being. Is that something that you, I mean, there's clearly some nodding, but I'm assuming, and I'd like to ask that question to you guys about actually, what does that feel like from your respective perspectives in working in the sector?
Well, we're not done, right? Like the effects of this pandemic are going to be with us for decades. And like, so part of what I'm doing as research for my dissertation is has to do with students who were freshmen during 2020, like who came into college in the fall of 2020. And it's really looking at, how does the stress that you are already experiencing as a freshman entering college, but then on top of that, the added stress of COVID, of being like locked down in your dorm room with people you've never met before, and like eating your food in your bed, going to class in your bed, all of those things. And then the social aspect of that, that's going to be with us for a while. And so I think what I would love to see higher ed putting a little more emphasis on is really building collaboration amongst our students, building community amongst our students, and using that as kind of the foundation for how we begin to repair these students who, and well, not repair the students, but really think proactively about how are we going to address the mental health havoc that has been wreaked by this pandemic, especially on students that are at this transition in their life, this huge transition into emerging adulthood. I think we're going to continue to see this for a long time, and so we can ignore it and we can pretend like this didn't happen and we're just going to go back to normal, but that's not going to end well, right? Like we've got to be prepared for this, and we've got to start thinking about this proactively.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think you raise many interesting points, Jennifer, and I think students who are in college now have no before, quote unquote. We all remember our own experience in college. We remember working, prior to the pandemic. These folks do not. So it's not about going back to something that they've never experienced. It's about really incorporating necessary changes and appreciating the pandemic has changed things, period. Of course, I work in disability resources. And so on our campus and anecdotally with colleagues across the country, we're seeing a lot more requests for accommodations, and a lot more requests for accommodations that are, a bit unpredictable, attendance, right? And extra time. I mean, things that we've accommodated for many, many years, that require flexibility and discussion with faculty. But it's not just disabled students who are experiencing this, right? It's like everyone, because no one's prepared, right? So they're coming to college not having gone to school in person in the last 2+ years. They get to college and they're like, yay, I'm going to go to class, and then realize I feel very uncomfortable here. I'm nervous. I don't know how to manage my time. I don't know how to meet people. So we really need to take it down to, obviously people go to school to get an education and they're educated outside the classroom as well. And community is very important. Student development occurs, kind of at all of these points. So how do we kind of put a new approach to community building, to your point, and really kind of scaffolding? Like, I think orientation needs to look different for all students. I mean, that's the interesting part of this conversation, right? Is that, we might have an interest in disability, but really all of this is about the student experience, the curricular experience. Disabled people are impacted by design, but so are others. And this is just another reminder of that. Like, we need more mental health support, whether that's probably less about someone who can write you a prescription and almost more about peer mentoring and coaching and more informal resources that are just kind of embedded into student life, because I think this is more and more common, more and more the norm. We need to integrate it and not expect students to have to go elsewhere to get these very basic supports that would benefit everyone.
I totally agree with both of your points. I think, there's an element of this, I think sometimes forgotten, which is the parity between, okay, I'm going to study at university level and get my degree and graduate and go into that job that I've wanted to do for however long. But like you said, Amanda, everything is new. It's the first step of a journey. We can reflect on our own journeys. And so this element around actually the whole experience at higher education level is not only about academic growth, it's about personal and lifelong growth. And they're the ripple effects that we will feel, I think, in society in another 3 to 5 years, if we're not really willing to kind of look at it much more with much more scrutiny than we currently are. And I think, as you mentioned earlier on, Jennifer, and I love the way that you kind of use the terms collaboration and community, because students inordinately, they want to create the community. And so actually, if you kind of give them the open environment in order to be part of that discussion, they're going to want to be part of that discussion because they will own it as part of that process. I am disappointed that we have taken up all of the time that we have in order to have this discussion, and much like the previous discussion, I think we could again talk about this for a long time. And I think one of the aspects that will aid, I think, the discussions that we'll be having at the conference is about student engagement, not only in the academic delivery, but also in how universities and providers deliver services to them, whether that's through their support services, their respective student services, through the careers pathway, and all of those aspects that we know affect all students, but taking into account those elements that we've talked about, where we know there is this feel in the sector that actually the mental health and well-being of student communities is changing, and we need to be anticipating what that might look like. And the only way to really fully anticipate that is to talk and listen to students with their direct experience. And on that note, I'm going to draw this conversation to a close. So I'd like to thank you both very much for, again, a wonderful conversation, for your patience in terms of actually recording the podcast and taking the time out to be part of this podcast. And in closing, I'm going to say to listeners and viewers, if you're able to join us at the AHEAD conference in mid-July, please do. I'm pretty sure there'll be plenty of resources, if you're not able to join us, that you'll be able to dip in and out of. And do feel free to contact myself or Amanda or Jennifer outside of the AHEAD forum as you may need. Thank you ever so much, Amanda. Is there anything you want to kind of finish with, Amanda, before we kind of close?
Well, another thank you for the conversation, because it's very exciting. And like you say, we could probably talk forever. I mean, I want to just kind of underscore like that access exists on a spectrum, right? Which is, I think, an important important to universal design, that we, in higher ed, we've kind of been trained to do compliance, right? Just to make something accessible over here. But access is very broad, and equity is at the other end of that spectrum, right? And universal design promotes equity, right? Disabled students deserve the same experience, that non-disabled students get at a university or an educational environment. So we can fulfill whether they're legal mandates, whether it's a commitment to accessibility, by implementing equitable solutions. It doesn't really work the other way. We can continue to put individualized accommodations in place that are retroactive, that are separate. Yes, we'll be doing what we need to do, but we won't be really promoting what you're so eloquently talking about is equity. So I think we have a lot of opportunity to expand our concept of what access looks like.
Thank you, Amanda. Jennifer?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that equity is the word right there. The equity and even the issues of ableism and systemic racism that are built into our higher ed system are all things that we have to continue to be proactively looking for, seeking out the barriers in our educational system, in our classrooms, in our online courses, so that we can be providing the most equitable educational experience that we can for our students in higher ed.
Absolutely. Thank you both. And those aspects, as you kind of mentioned about the complexities, and I suppose we haven't really even had the time to talk about, I suppose, the intersectional elements associated with inclusion, which are hugely important given the complexities of us as individuals, as human beings, and particularly for the student community, that element of how it links into kind of that personal growth, that lifelong growth, that academic growth. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for listening and for watching, and hopefully we'll see you at the AHEAD conference. Take care.